So all the participants are requested to mute their microphone. So we'll start this webinar in a few minutes time. So please wait. So all the participants are requested to mute their microphone and turn off their camera while attending the webinar.
So Dr. Rajivan, we are online, we are live on YouTube.
Yes.
Maybe we can start.
Yeah. All the participants are requested to turn off their camera. So Dr. Manabendra, can we start now?
Yes, yes, we can start now. Okay.
So good morning to all of you. Good morning to all of you. We'll be starting the webinar shortly. This webinar is organized by Breakthrough Science Society. And you know that Breakthrough Science Society is an All India science organization. Yeah. So Breakthrough Science Society is an All India science organization trying to develop scientific temper in society. We organize a number of programs like webinars, workshops, sky observation sessions, all with an aim to inculcate scientific temper in society and also to generate interest in basic science among students. So this webinar is again organized as a part of our activities. And to deliver this talk here, we have Dr. M. Subramani with us. Now, I request Dr. Srigumaran to start the session. Dr. Srigumaran, your microphone is muted. You have to unmute your microphone.
Okay. A very happy morning to you all. My role is to introduce the distinguished speaker of this webinar, Dr. M. Subramani. He is joining us from the United States of Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Subramani trained as a physician, had completed a research fellowship in cardiology from the Medical College Trivandrum. Intrigued by the talk on the potential of artificial intelligence for medical decision making, he decided to formally get trained in computer science and biomedical informatics. He obtained an MS in computer science from the University of South Carolina, Columbia in 1994. He worked as a postgraduate researcher in machine learning at the University of California, Irvine. He also completed his PhD in artificial intelligence and biomedical informatics from the University of Pittsburgh in 2005. He then joined as a faculty member in the Department of Biomedical Informatics in Vanderbilt University, USA in 2006, and served as a director of the Discovery Systems Lab over there. He then moved to the Translation Informatics Division in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of New Mexico as professor at the end of 2012. And from there, he retired from the academia just a few years ago. We are very thankful to Dr. Subramani for accepting our invitation to deliver this talk. On behalf of the Breakthrough Science Society, Kerala, and also on behalf of all the participants of this webinar, I extend a warm welcome to him. Welcome, sir. I would request him to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sriumaran, for the nice introduction. Let's get started here. So basically, I would like to say good morning to all the participants tuning in from Trivandrum, and good evening to all the folks who are joining from the United States. Since this is July 4th here and it is Independence Day in the United States, I also wish all the people joining from the United States a happy Independence Day. So let's get started with viruses, vaccines, and the race for a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Since we are living in unusual times, I thought I will start with a short message and then dive into the topic.
Newton.
To my young friends, of course, it can apply to everybody. These are interesting and turbulent times. It is not business as usual. There is the COVID-19 pandemic. There is also a mass protest movement against racial discrimination and inequities that is raging in the US and creating ripples worldwide. The young are calling for a change in many parts of the world. Yes, it is necessary to learn from parents and teachers, but is it sufficient? If you just acquire what the elderly already know, you can't solve the problems of the world. You have to go beyond their understanding, create and apply new knowledge, and then move forward. I would like to support the current movement on my behalf and with your permission on behalf of all the participants. Black Lives Matter, Minority Lives Matter, and Oppressed Lives Matter. So let's get started. So I would like to declare that I don't have a financial conflict of interest in the subject which I'm going to present today. So this will be the roadmap for today's presentation. So I'll just introduce the pandemic based on the trajectory in numbers. And that is the context we should keep in mind when we discuss viruses, vaccines, and also the progress. So I'll introduce a representative sample of the viruses, starting with smallpox and then going on to chickenpox, the human immunodeficiency virus, hepatitis C virus, and then of course, SARS-CoV-2. Then we look into, and in a very brief way, the types of immunity, innate and adaptive, and then move on to the vaccines, some basics of vaccines, types, timeline, and then we'll discuss in some detail the current progress, whatever we have achieved so far in moving towards a good vaccine for COVID-19. So we'll introduce some of the candidate vaccines which are on the leaderboard currently, and then some preliminary evidence from ongoing trials. And then we will, in an informed way, discuss where we can go from here. So the learning objectives are as follow. Obtain an understanding of viruses in general, including SARS-CoV-2, develop insight into basic principles of vaccinology, and then get to know the basic vaccine development steps and how they relate to SARS-CoV-2. So keep this in context. So you might hear from an anchor on TV that a lab here has developed, maybe in the US, maybe in Europe, maybe in India, has developed a vaccine. Immediately, we should not jump to the conclusion that 2 weeks from today, we will get a vaccine and then the COVID-19 epidemic will be behind us and the world will go back to where it was 5 months ago or 6 months ago or 7 months ago. You should be able to evaluate this type of information from a scientific approach, and for that a background is necessary. So that is the approach I'm taking in today's presentation. So let's look at, as introduction, the COVID-19 trajectory over 3 months. So approximately 3 months ago, I did a primer on COVID-19 and the virus. So at that time, actually, so that was in early April. So we had 1.7 million cases globally. And now it has increased to 11.3. Again, early April, new cases, that is per day, 75,000 new cases were being detected. And that has 209,000. The total deaths till that more.
Ms. Nisha Jain, please mute your microphone.
Professor Subramani, please unmute your microphone.
So the total deaths in early April were a little more than 100,000, and currently it is more than 500,000. Early April again, new deaths, that is per day, was 6,000. It has gone down a little bit. Again, you can see that different countries, the trend is the same. So in USA also, it has increased considerably from less than 0.5 million to 2.9 million. Again, total deaths from 18,000 to 132,000. Same is the case with Brazil and Russia. There were many countries in Europe which were occupying leading position in terms of being affected, but they have all fallen off due to better control. Whereas Brazil, Russia, and India have taken the second, third, and fourth spots, unfortunately. So India had 7,600 in early April, total number of cases, and that has gone up to almost 700,000 now. And new cases per day was less than 1,000, and it's now close to 25,000. And again, total deaths have gone up from about 250 to close to 20,000. And same is the trajectory for the new deaths from 22 to 450. So let's keep this in our background as we look at some of the viruses. So the first I'm going to introduce is the smallpox or variola virus, which is an old virus. Everybody has heard about smallpox. So it belongs to the family of poxviridae, which also consists of the cowpox virus, monkeypox virus, vaccinia virus, and some other viruses also, which we won't look into today. The cowpox virus was originally used by Dr. Edward Jenner for vaccination in 1778. Later on, it was replaced by the vaccinia virus. And smallpox, as we all know, was eradicated in 1977 from the face of this planet. The World Health Organization then recommended ceasing vaccination in all countries. But US has recently licensed a new vaccine. This happened in 2007, the recombinant vaccine. And US and Russia have large stockpiles of smallpox vaccine. And they are possibly immunizing their military personnel for smallpox biodefense purposes. The next in line is the varicella zoster virus. So the primary infection caused by this virus is varicella or chickenpox. More than 4 million cases used to occur in the United States before vaccination started in full swing in 1995. So it presents with fever, generalized itchy rash, which lasts for 4 to 5 days, more on the trunk and head. Immunization is done with live attenuated vaccine, and it's available for both children and adults. As treatment, there is an antiviral called acyclovir, which reduces severity in both varicella and the other presentation, which we'll briefly get into, which is herpes zoster or zoster for short. So that's the secondary infection. It's a belated manifestation. It's called zoster or also as shingles. Reactivation of latent varicella zoster virus. That is the cause of zoster, and that is because of declining cellular immunity. And it presents as a localized skin lesion, but it is confined to 1 to 3 dermatomal segments, and it is unilaterally distributed. The immunization principle is same. So a very high dose of varicella vaccine is marketed as the shingles vaccine. So let's consider the HIV or the human immunodeficiency virus. So in 2018, that's a couple of years ago, there were 38 million people living with HIV globally. And every year, 1.1 million new infections are occurring, and close to 800,000 new deaths in 1 year due to HIV. There are two types, HIV-1 and HIV-2, and these are enveloped RNA viruses, and it belongs to the family Retroviridae. There is we won't get into the details, but to understand the structure, a cartoon picture is also presented here. And transmission of HIV is by intimate contact and by contaminated blood products. Loss of CD4 cells leads to opportunistic infections and malignancies. And what about the vaccine status? There is currently no effective vaccine, unfortunately, for HIV. There are various challenges presented by the virus. One, the antigenic diversity of HIV proteins causes lots of problems. Genetic diversity of the virus and high mutation rates is very challenging. The viral genome integrates to host cell chromosome. And again, the major target of the virus is the immune system. Fortunately, effective treatment is available, and an effective combination therapy is needed, and it can suppress viral replication continuously if taken continuously. So lifelong treatment is needed, but there is no cure. That is because latent viral reservoir can be detected. It is present even after decades of antiretroviral treatment. Now let's look at hepatitis C virus or HCV. So again, there is a cartoon picture there. We won't get into the details. It's a single-stranded RNA virus and it was identified in 1989. 3% of the world's population, so approximately 190 million or close to 200 million people are affected by this virus. The transmission is in developed countries typically by injection drug use, and in developing countries it is contaminated medical instruments and contaminated injection needles and so on. There can also be due to transmission due to injection drug use in developing countries also. Clinical manifestation is, so it presents as acute hepatitis, and half the people actually develop a chronic form of hepatitis. The acute form continues into a chronic version after some time. And this chronic hepatitis can progress to liver cysts in a subset of the patients. And again, unfortunately, there is no effective vaccine currently for HCV, and it also presents some challenges. So there is a worldwide genetic diversity of HCV, and it can evade antibody responses. It also suppresses cell-mediated immunity, so that makes it very, very challenging. Fortunately, recently, in the last few years, again, combination antiviral therapy is available, and the evidence is not very clear, but it is very effective, and possibly it can give these patients a cure, but much more follow-up is needed because these have been introduced only in the last few years. Now let's look into the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So again, we have a picture here which is presented by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, US. So this was sequenced by researchers in China and made publicly available in early January. So the viral sequence holds about 30,000 nucleotides. It's a single-stranded RNA virus. So it has an RNA inner core with an outer layer of protein and a lipid coat. And you can see the crown-like projections on the surface, which give it a corona appearance. It is heat sensitive, susceptible to lipid solvents such as vinegar and acetone. So let's look into some additional details. So we won't go into too much of the details of the genome here, but we can see that close to the 3' end. So we have the part of the genome or set of genes which give rise to the spike protein here. And there are also, this segment of the genome gives rise to the E, M, and N proteins here. So the pathogenesis is as follows. The SARS-CoV-2 virus enters the human body via droplets through the nose, mouth, or eyes. The virus enters the cells in the airway by binding the viral surface spike protein to the human angiotensin converting enzyme 2 or ACE2 receptor. So the ACE2 receptor is present on the, say for example, the alveolar surface of the lung and also in some of the other tissues, heart, vascular endothelium, and the kidneys. So the spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor and then gains entry into the cell. So the main portal of viral entry seems to be the lung alveolar cells. So let's spend a little bit of time to understand the immunity. So we have basically two sets of immune responses. One is innate, or which we are born with, which we have it. And then the other one is adaptive immunity, which is based on the antigens that are introduced foreign into our body. So let's consider an infection here. So we can get an infection through the nose or mouth. So there is the intestine here and the lungs. So the skin or mucosa is penetrated by the bugs, and then so the bugs enter through the skin. So the first line of defense are the macrophages, and they try to tackle these pathogens, and they enter the lymph node. And so we can see the bone marrow produces what are called B lymphocytes, and the thymus generates the T lymphocytes. But they also sort of get into the lymph node, and there some sort of interaction takes place between the macrophages and these cells. So lymphocyte activation and differentiation happens here, and that is how the adaptive immunity occurs. And then through the heart, it goes to the tissues for the effector responses here, as you can see. And then a subset holds the memory for tackling future infections. So as memory cells, they just lie low. Of course, the immune system is very complicated. I have just given you a very basic understanding of the innate and adaptive immunity and the interaction. So let's just keep that in mind. So again, continuing on those lines, so as we said, so for innate immunity, we have macrophages. Recognition of pathogens by genetically conserved receptors. So we are sort of born with that. So it's not reactive. They initiate adaptive immune response. And the adaptive immunity is modulated by, as we said, B and T lymphocytes.
Mr. Engineer, please mute your microphone.
Yeah. So we are talking about adaptive immunity here. So B and T lymphocytes are okay. So B and T lymphocytes are involved in adaptive immunity. So they recognize pathogens in an antigen-specific manner, and that's very, very important, as we soon see. So produce pathogen-specific antibodies. The B cells are responsible for that. And then the T cells are involved in modulating cytokine release, and they are also responsible for organizing the adaptive defense mechanisms or immune mechanisms. As you can see here, so if infection or immunization occurs here, so this is the timeline. So there is a period of expansion where the immunity develops, and then it goes into the contraction phase, and then we develop the memory. And then when reinfection or immunization booster happens here, so then there is a sudden spike of the recall immune mechanisms. So this type of graph holds good for the antibody titer, and also it holds good for the antigen-specific T cell response. Let's also look into herd immunity, which is also an important concept. So this refers to the proportion of a population that must be immunized with a vaccine for a specific infectious disease to generate a threshold. So the threshold actually depends on the transmissibility factor. So the higher the transmissibility, you need a higher threshold actually. This is to ensure that an entire population is protected from the infectious disease. So it actually confers direct and indirect protective effect. So direct for the immunized and indirect for the non-immunized. So here you can see blue colored guys, so they are the immunized folks, and the non-immunized are seen in red. So you can see that the blue guys actually surround the red guys, and even though the red guys are not immunized, a person who brings in new infection cannot actually easily infect them. So the community is protected like that. So now let's look into the vaccination milestones and then move on to some timelines actually. So as we said earlier, in the late 1700s, the smallpox vaccine, cowpox virus by Dr. Jenner. And then Pasteur took over, and he used an empirical approach, and that was used by other people also. So this went on from 1885 through 1950. So rabies, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, BCG, all this fall in this formalism. Then we developed the recombinant DNA methods, and hepatitis B and papilloma virus vaccine was developed in the early 80s using that method. Then vaccinology developed, and in the early 90s, glycoconjugation methods were used, and that gave us meningococcal. So this is A, C, W, and Y, which refers to different antigens there. We also got the Haemophilus influenzae type B or Hib vaccine, then for pneumonia, then also for Staph aureus. Then later on, we moved on to bioinformatics methods and so on. So that's the genome-derived reverse vaccinology, which gave us the meningococcal B vaccine. So that was in early 2010 and a little bit beyond. So this table actually gives us a picture of the public health impact of vaccination. So the data is from US, but I'm sure all countries have a similar picture, and this actually can be extrapolated to different countries. So we can see that the 20th century morbidity before vaccines were introduced for various diseases, starting from smallpox. So smallpox, there used to be close to 50,000 cases every year. Diphtheria, 175,000 plus. Pertussis also close to that, and so on. So when vaccines were introduced, by 1998, smallpox had already been eradicated, and you can see that there is a very substantial decrease in morbidity. So either it is 100% or it is in the high 90s, the percentage decrease. And I think that tells us that vaccines are very effective when a successful vaccine can be developed. Now let's look into some of the basic vaccination principles. So these are the keywords here: attenuation, inactivation, conjugation, and recombination. So there are some live attenuated vaccines which were very effective. They are still effective. Measles, mumps, and rubella, they are all viral diseases. BCG, as we all know, is the vaccine for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Then inactivated vaccines were developed for polio. Actually, live attenuated vaccine was also later developed for polio. And hepatitis A, and again, tetanus toxoid is also an inactivated vaccine for a bacteria. Conjugated subunit vaccines were later developed. So protein conjugate gave us the pertussis and hepatitis B vaccine. Then carbohydrate conjugates gave us the pneumococcus and meningococcus vaccine. Then recombinant vaccine involving DNA and RNA also came later on. So there are also, in an orthogonal way, you can look at newer vaccine developments based on vector-driven vaccines using virus-like particles. Vaccines, we won't get into the details of those in this lecture. So let's look at nucleic acid vaccines in a little bit of detail. So they use antigen encoding plasmid DNA or RNA. Messenger RNA or mRNA or viral replicons are also used. Nucleic acid is taken up by the cell and translated. So that means protein synthesis. So humoral and cell-mediated immune response can be generated. So there are some advantages these nucleic acid vaccines give us. So these vaccines are cell-free. So there's no possibility of any infection being generated by these vaccines. And we don't need any biosafety level 2 lab for development of these vaccines. And then production can be speeded up as the manufacturing process is synthetic. But there are also some disadvantages. Nucleic acid is fragile, particularly messenger RNA. So we'll have to have cold storage. Then there is another category of vaccines. Again, we won't get into a lot of details, but they are interesting. So basically, therapeutic vaccines, you should look at it as immunotherapy. So they form the field of immunotherapy. And particularly for cancer, they show a lot of promise, and they are subject matter of intense research these days. But there are also some difficulties. It's very resource intensive. You have to personalize it. So it's called personalized tumor immunotherapy. But there are also some vaccines which have been licensed for prostate cancer. So there is a prostate cancer vaccine, and there is our goal BCG for bladder cancer. And these are somewhat effective. That's what I gathered. Then there are, interestingly, non-infectious, non-cancer vaccines. They are referred to as NINC. So we'll just mention them and leave it there. These are still in the proof of concept and developmental stage. They are not currently a substitute for drugs for tackling these conditions or other measures for tackling these conditions. So vaccines are being developed for addiction, for high blood pressure. People are looking into developing vaccines for obesity, and as I mentioned, they're still in early stages or experimental stages. So let's also look at vaccines, immunity, and age. So that's also important. So immune protection by vaccine is easier in the young, because the immune system is very good in younger people. Immune protection is very challenging in older people. Low efficacy of seasonal influenza vaccine has been easily demonstrated in the elderly. Immune competence decreases with increasing age. So that's called immunosenescence. Changes at multiple levels of the immune system occurs over time. Reduced lymphopoiesis in bone marrow, and that affects production of B cells and T cells, which are very critical for adaptive immunity. And again, thymus atrophy can result in reduced output of the native T lymphocytes, and reduced lymphopoiesis in bone marrow can predominantly affect the B cells. T cell receptors and B cell receptors are also affected in various ways. So a conventional vaccine based on young adult responses may not be highly effective in older adults. So that's also a challenge for vaccine development. So for seniors and older people, adaptive immunotherapy with neutralizing monoclonal antibodies might be needed in the elderly. So let's do some of the vaccine protection mechanisms. So vaccines do not prevent pathogen entry or transient pathogen growth. So it takes over an immune perspective, but it cannot really physically prevent entry into the system. So the mechanism is as follows. It stimulates host immune response. So it can block the pathogenesis, but not the pathogen entry. So it inhibits growth and development of the pathogen, prevents occurrence of clinical manifestations of disease. And the goal of vaccines is to induce adaptive immunity specific for vaccine antigens, and that's the most effective mechanism. The innate immunity can act only as a blunt instrument, and it may not work very well. So the vaccines initiate the development of persistent antibody and memory B cell and T cell responses. As we saw, so that's the adaptive immunity. And it protects the vaccinated individual on later contact with the virulent pathogen. And vaccine components engage the innate immune components. And the innate immune components then activate the adaptive immune components. And that's how this immune mechanism is unleashed. Let's look at the vaccine development process. So you can see that the traditional timeline painted here is 10 to 15 years. And then you have to allow further time for manufacturing. So that has been the typical method. And you can see that there are gaps between each step. So there is the exploratory stage, then preclinical, and then there are clinical trials. And these vaccine development processes can drop off at any stage, even at the exploratory stage, or later at the preclinical, or at the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Only after all these phases are completed, then you submit what is called a biologic license application. And then FDA, and there are regulatory agencies in different countries, and they review and approve. And this typically takes 1 year. Move on to manufacture. So comes with the current timeline which these vaccines are chasing, the candidate vaccines are chasing. So people are trying to come up with a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. So exploratory and preclinical were quickly completed once the gene sequence was made available in January, and the clinical trials have started. So what's happening is, instead of waiting for the clinical trials to complete and an application to be received, so FDA is doing a rolling review and approval in a staggered way. And manufacturing is also ramping up, again, sort of overlapping with this process. And that is how they are trying to accomplish this, or they are saying that they are going to accomplish this. Let's see how realistic this is and what we can infer based on some additional information. So let's into some details, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So these are the most important phases because these form part of human trials, or what we call as clinical trials. So the phase 1 is based on testing healthy volunteers with the antigen. So they should all be first SARS-CoV-2 test negative. So typically this is done on a small number of patients, 20 to 80 subjects, let's say. And safety and tolerability are the main criteria that we are trying to infer. And if possible, we will also get a handle on immunogenicity in a simple way. So once this is passed, then we move on to phase 2 studies. So they are larger studies. They typically enroll 100 to 1,000 subjects, sometimes even more. And the main goal is immunogenicity, dosage, and then of course adverse events, and we have to titrate the dose. If phase 2 is successful, then we move on to phase 3. These are very large scale studies, and these are all actually resource intensive, even phase 2. And then the resource intensity, that is the number of patients, and in general, the expenses, human as well as in money terms, increases as we move from phase 1 through phase 3. So these are large scale studies, 1,000 to 10,000 subjects. Typically, they are randomized, placebo controlled, and double blinded. And efficacy and safety, this is for a fixed dose and schedule. And hopefully we get all this. The fixed dose and schedule is informed by the phase 2 studies. And once the phase 3 is completed, then you give the biological license application, as we said earlier. So let's look at this meningococcal vaccine, meningococcal B or MEN-B vaccine timeline. So this was sequenced. The MEN-B genome was sequenced and made available in the late 1990s. And it had more than 2,000 genes. So 570 were selected using bioinformatics method. So this method is called reverse vaccinology. So you just go from the sequence and try to develop a vaccine. Then out of these 350 genes expressed as recombinant proteins in E. coli, and then mice were used to develop an immune response. So the investigators found that 91 proteins actually generated sufficient antibodies. 28 proteins out of that actually induced a serum bactericidal response. Then finally, after 7 years, 5 candidate proteins were selected to be included in the vaccine. And then after some more years, for different, as we saw, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials and so on, in 2013, this vaccine was licensed. So it took almost 15 years for this vaccine to be successful. So in short, what we would like to understand is that it is a good idea to cut corners in vaccine development. So vaccines for measles, mumps, rubella, polio, smallpox, and influenza, there's a long history of safe use, developed with stringent regulatory requirements. Preclinical and clinical evidence of safety and efficacy is needed, and they were well documented before proceeding to licensing and then inoculation. So previous SARS-CoV vaccine, that is the SARS-CoV-1 vaccine. So during preclinical trials, so there were worrisome immune responses manifested in ferrets and monkeys, but mice were, there are different types of reports where there were different issues. So it was shown to be safe in some of the animal studies, but not safe in other animal studies and so on. And vaccine-associated disease enhancement is also a possibility. We currently have, for example, many fraudulent SARS-CoV-2 antibody tests. This was reported in newspapers due to lax regulation. So for vaccination, we don't want any similar duds or worse dangerous vaccine. So we have to be, so it's a cautionary statement actually, which I think makes a lot of sense. So let's look at some more timelines. So these are for the emergent viruses. So as we alluded to, for MERS and SARS-CoV-1, there is no vaccine even after 6 years for MERS and after 17 years for SARS-CoV-1. For Ebola, actually, after 15 years, so the Canadian team actually came up with a proof of concept vaccine in 2005. So they published the methodology and so on. Then it took actually 15 years for a vaccine to be licensed. So this happened actually last year. And for polio, it took almost 60 years. Of course, that was in the late part of the 19th and early part of 20th century and so on. So we don't need to take time these days. And we were very accelerated for SARS-CoV-2. So again, researchers are saying that they are attempting to deliver a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. So let's keep this timeline in mind while we discuss additional information. So let's look at some of the candidate vaccines. So these are the candidate vaccines which are on the leaderboard. So I won't get into all the details here. So there are different platforms here. So you can see that this is a non-replicating viral vector vaccine. Again, the same one. So there is an RNA vaccine, there's an inactivated vaccine, and so on. So the first one is the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca. And this is the only vaccine which has just now moved into phase 3 trials. So they are seriously starting that. And then the other one, which is into actually completed phase 1 and moving into is the CanSino Biological Inc. in collaboration with the Beijing Institute of Biotechnology. Then there is the Moderna and NIH. So this is an institute in NIH. So they have the mRNA vaccine actually. So I have some comments here. So the University of Oxford candidate vaccine is supposed to be completed in 1 year from now actually. And for the Moderna vaccine, they have given different times for the phase 1 in November and phase 2 in August of 2021. But they are also saying that if everything goes well and they get incredible early results, they can actually wind up the trials quickly and actually deliver the vaccine much earlier. So let's look at a couple of more vaccines and then go into some additional details. So there is the Novavax, which is the protein subunit vaccine. And there is the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine, which is an RNA vaccine, again, mRNA vaccine. And they have completed phase 1 and they are moving to phase 2. Then there's another, which is a DNA vaccine or DNA plasmid vaccine that is by Inovio Pharmaceuticals. They are in phase 1. So let's look at the summary here. So WHO has presented this table, or have abstracted the information from a much larger WHO presentation. So phase 3, as we saw, only the Oxford group has something going on, which has advanced to phase 3. So they have an overlapping phase 2 and phase 3. It's a little bit complicated. Then phase 2, there are 7 actually. And phase 9, phase 1, there are 9 more candidate vaccines, and in the preclinical stage, including, I think, one from India. So we have 129. So there are many vaccine candidates in the race. So there is hope that by the game of numbers, 1 or 2 or maybe 3 will be successful at a reasonable time. So let's look into some details of some of these vaccines which are in the leaderboard. So we talked about the Oxford vaccine. So this is a randomized single blind. So they are using the meningitis vaccine controlled group as their control group instead of placebo control. So again, as we said, they are in phase 3 with 2,000 participants. That's their goal. And again, the outcome measures are somewhat standard. So the primary goal is to actually find out out of these 2,000 participants who are randomized, how many people will become COVID positive over the duration of the study. And then they will also look into the secondary goals, which is for safety purposes. And they will also assign the immunogenicity based on antibody studies. So the study protocol, again, so they are confined to adults between 18 and 55. And so there is this protocol. We won't get into all the details here. So they are using an adenovirus as a vector with the spike protein gene inserted. The CanSino Biological Inc. and Beijing Institute of Biotech. So they have a start date of April. So they already actually they have also completed the phase 1 study and they have published the results. We'll look into that shortly in general. and they have a completion date of January 2021 for, as I understand, phase 2. So they are also using adenovirus vector for the participants, and the primary and secondary goals are similar. So they have a safety and then immunogenicity estimation. So they have 3 groups actually. So evaluating low dose and middle dose. They eliminated high dose, I believe, in the phase 1 study, and it is placebo controlled. Then there is the Moderna and NIH mRNA vaccine. It was in the news also. They are also holding a lot of promise. So it's a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. So they have moved to phase 2 with 600 participants. So again, they are evaluating safety and efficacy. So they have many study arms here. So they are trying to titrate the dosage 50 micrograms and 100 micrograms, and then it is placebo controlled. They also have one group of 55 plus for placebo. Then there is the Pfizer and BioNTech group here. So they have also, I believe, completed phase 1 and trying to move to phase 2, for which, so this is a multi-site and again randomized placebo-controlled blinded trial. They are trying to recruit 7,600 participants, and again they have the safety and adverse reactions, and secondary the immunogenicity study. So they have actually a much broader age group because of their multi-site. I think they have included Brazil also as one of their sites, if I remember correctly. So they have adults in the 18 to 64, then 65 to 85, and in another site, I think they are recruiting from 18 through 85. So this is a single or double dose. They have a detailed for this. Then there is the protein subunit vaccine being developed and tested by Novavax. So this is also a randomized controlled study. So this is using spike protein nanoparticle vaccine basically. So they also have phase 1 and 2 with 131 participants. So same outcome measures here. So their study protocol is a little bit different. I think they have also made a lot of progress in phase 1, and I believe so. They started with an optional extension to phase 2, and I think they're getting there. So preliminary reports. So only one, the University of Oxford hasn't published, so they have actually reported. Again, this is not in a peer-reviewed journal. Moderna also have seen some reports, and again, BioNTech, Pfizer also. Only CanSino has published in a peer-reviewed journal their phase 1 study. So all these 4 groups report observing neutralizing antibodies, which is actually good news. But as I said, only the CanSino has published the results in a peer-reviewed journal. So based on our trying to, I know that I have provided quickly a lot of information in one stretch, if you will. But let's just look at it. And so this is my informed guess based on what I have tried to understand based on the principles of vaccination and then comparing, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus with, say, HIV and HCV, where we failed to develop a vaccine. So SARS-CoV-2, we haven't seen that much diversity in terms of genetics. Of course, all viruses mutate, but we haven't seen distinct strains. So the antibodies, the adaptive immune system, which will be triggered by these vaccines, should be effective when the virus gets into the system where the adaptive immunity system has been triggered. So based on those assumptions and so on, and taking the timeline into consideration, and the based on whatever results we have available, and the progress what we can see so far. So there is still the possibility that 1 year from now there could be no approved vaccine, and that I'm taking it as like 10%. That's the probability, and 5% I see that we will have a highly efficacious vaccine, 90% efficacy. Then a much more moderate efficacy, 70% in like 20%. Then 25%, 50% general efficacy, less than 50%, which will still be useful and could be licensed. So again, if you project 1 year further, again, I'm presenting this as an educated guess. So again, no approved vaccine, I'm retaining at 10%, but all these have increased further. So 90% efficacy, 10%, and this is like 30%, another 30%, and this is 20%. So again, this is an educated guess. So let's just talk a little bit about the COVID-19 disease, which 3 months ago I presented in detail. But let's just quickly go over the clinical manifestations. So as probably most of you know already, SARS-CoV-2 is a respiratory virus, so predominantly affects the respiratory system, causing bilateral pneumonia. It's also known to cause cardiovascular and neurological manifestations in a subset of patients. So as we saw, there's no effective vaccine currently. Trial candidate vaccines ongoing, and they hold reasonable promise, I will say. There are some challenges. The pandemic is still evolving, so the virus is still evolving. So we only have experienced this virus for 6 months now, and most countries are affected. So there are some reports that there have been some additional strains, so there's some controversy that some of them are more lethal and so on, but there isn't a clear evidence to that effect. There's no definitive treatment, but there are some experimental treatments available. Remdesivir and dexamethasone has been shown to reduce morbidity. So what are the effective preventive measures currently available? So they have been proven to be effective. So hand washing is one, masking is another, wearing masks. Social distancing has been shown to be very effective. Avoiding large and small gatherings is effective. Then testing, tracing based on that isolation and quarantine, all these steps are very effective. So I would like to conclude based on a cautious, optimistic approach. So in terms of vaccine development, so we have many candidate vaccines in the race. We have also limited preliminary encouraging reports. Again, for treatment, no specific antiviral treatment so far to cure COVID-19. As we said earlier, remdesivir and dexamethasone can decrease morbidity. Additional drugs are under evaluation. And still, prevention is better than cure, holds good for COVID-19 so far. So I would let you read this for a few seconds. So I would like to conclude quoting Einstein here. So I think the pandemic actually tells us clearly that this is the state we should consider very, very seriously. So imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. I think that is the lesson this pandemic is teaching us. Very nicely said by Einstein more than 70, 80 years ago. So I would like to acknowledge the Breakthrough Science Society and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to place my thoughts on this topic. And I would like to especially thank the school students and the young inquiring minds tuning in for their interest. And of course, there is a huge burden on them. They are expected to change the world. Thank you all. So I'll be happy to hear your comments, and if you have any questions, I will try my best to answer them. And if you need to reach me later on with questions, you can email me at this email address. Thank you very much, and let me conclude here.
Thank you, sir.
So,
Dr. Srikumaran?
Yes.
so before you start, Dr. Srikumaran, some general instruction to the viewer, in particular on Zoom, that please switch on your video, but keep your mic on mute mode. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. There is an option on Zoom. You can raise your hand and we will pick up the question one by one. So please switch on your video, but keep your mic on mute mode. Whenever you ask question, please unmute, place your question and again go to mute mode. Okay, so we start. Okay. So Dr. Srikumaran, please go ahead.
Dr. Subramani, it was a very wonderful talk showing us the future where we are going to. There are a few questions which can be put up by the participants itself. One is Priyalika Tripathi. Can you please turn on your microphone and your video to put in your questions, please? Priyalika Tripathi.
Priyalika Tripathi, can you please turn on your video, unmute your mic and place the question, please? Okay, I think.
Okay, good morning, sir.
Yes, sir, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Can I ask question here now?
Sir, please proceed.
Okay, sir. Good morning, sir. It's a wonderful presentation with all details about the vaccines and the pandemic in the new normal conditions. Sir, phase 3 is that phase 3 requires the test efficacy of the vaccines on a large number of participants and take a longer time. So is it possible to develop COVID-19 vaccine within 2 months as declared recently in our country? Then what are the major constraints of COVID-19 vaccines development? Or if it is developed, what about the supply constraints in both physical and political barriers across the country? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it is. So this is interesting. So for phase 3 trials, actually, it will be helpful. I mean, fortunately and unfortunately, if the epidemic is raging, then you will be able to actually distinguish between the placebo group and the vaccinated group and quickly find out if the vaccine is effective, even if you have enrolled a subset of the patients. So you will not need tens of thousands of patients. So if the incidence of the disease is less, you are accumulating cases very slowly, then the phase 3 will be stretched much longer. So there is a possibility that the phase 3 could be condensed. So for example, in the US now it is raging in many states. In Brazil it is raging. In Mexico it is raging. In India also, some of the metropolitan centers, you can see that cases have shot up a lot. So it depends on, again, to move the study from one place to another is difficult. But if it is planned well, it is possible to probably complete phase 3 studies in a few months. 2 months might be very, very optimistic, but it might be possible to complete it within, say, 6 to 12 months or something like that. Again, so manufacturing is also, so there is this sort of straddled approach where if you find that some vaccine is showing a lot of promise, you start taking a lot of, so you lose and resource, but you will be able to bring in the vaccine early on. But as we also said, if we try to speed up too much, we may end up with an unsafe vaccine. So it is a delicate dance around all these variables and parameters. So in some sense, it is anybody's guess how fast we can move regarding this. So it's always better to be a little bit cautious here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
I request Dr. Swati Sinha to put her questions. Please turn on your video as well as the microphone.
Dr. Swati Sinha, can you please come forward and place your question? Yes, Dr. Swati Sinha. Okay, maybe we go for the next question till the time Dr. Swati Sinha shows up. So one person raised his hand. It's Dr. Babu PS. Can you please come forward and place your question? Dr. Babu PS. Please switch on your video and unmute your mic and place the question.
Dr. Babu PS.
Okay, Dr. Swati Sinha. Yeah, so please place your question, Dr. Swati Sinha. Yes, Dr. Swati Sinha.
ऑडिबल नहीं है ना, आवाज नहीं आ रही.
It's audible. Please go ahead.
Hello?
Please go ahead.
Am I?
Babu PS to turn on the microphone.
Yes.
In the video. Dr. Babu PS.
Speak now.
Am I audible?
Okay, maybe one by one. One by one, we take the question from Dr. Swati Sinha and then we pass to Dr. Babu. Please, Swati Sinha, you are clearly audible. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sir, my question is, since we know that positive sense RNA has advantage in causing infection, so is there any advantage of having positive sense RNA for developing a vaccine in?
Can you repeat your question once again? The voice got broken. Dr. Swati Sinha. Dr. Swati Sinha.
Sir, my question is, since we know that positive sense RNA has advantage in terms of causing infection in human, or we can say any living organism, so does we have any advantage in developing a vaccine using this property of virus, that it is a positive sense RNA, so it is easy, or is it difficult to develop a vaccine?
Actually, it is not clear what type of, since they haven't published the details in a journal. So there are various types of RNA being used by some of these candidate
Hello,
vaccine
am I
companies. So
audible to all of you?
Yes,
so
Dr. Swati. We heard you.
So the messenger RNA, which is being used by, for example, Moderna and also by Pfizer. So they are hoping that basically this messenger RNA will get translated into the spike protein, and that will act as the antigen and unleash the immune response. So that is what I gather. So only when they publish additional details about the method, we can understand this in a more nuanced manner. So that is all I can elaborate on that point, but it's a good question.
Maybe we move on to Dr. Babu PS. Can you please unmute your mic and place your question? Yes.
Am I audible? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I have 3 questions. One is considering the daily death rate in the United States. Is that country past the peak of the epidemic? Is it flattening or plateauing? That is one question. Another is among the different vaccine developers, is there any public sector entity or a company doing that? The government sector firm. That's another question. And third one, what will be the cost for the patient? Have you any idea? Can you estimate it in any way? The final cost that's coming. That's all.
So let me take up the last question first. So as I understand, there is enormous pressure on different governments actually to make it affordable, if possible, freely available in different settings. So there is pressure from the people on the restaurants for that. How it will eventually play out is not clear. So in a very optimistic scenario where multiple vaccines come successful and production can also be ramped up, then it will be less of an issue. If only one vaccine is successful and production becomes a limiting step, then of course, like it happens with anything, like it happened with ventilators, it happened with PPE, it happened with PCR testing. So generally, this will find, unfortunately, a direction towards richer countries. So it is difficult to discuss beyond this at this time. The second question was related to the peak. Is that correct? So how can we determine whether? So if you look at the graph of different countries, so generally it was easy to see that some of the European countries had peaked because they started a descent. So it was almost like you climb a mountain and then start descending. But for some other countries, for example, US, it was stuck in a plateau for a long time, and then it started climbing again. And if you see the curve for India, it is still in the climbing stage. So, and then large countries, again, there will be multiple peaks and so on. For smaller countries, it will be typically much more narrow. So you will have to look at the data over a period of time, and always remember that we have experience only for 6 months, and we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure. So this is going to play out at least for many more months, if not many years, and you can reasonably expect that this is going to play out for at least 1 or 2 years. So it's too early to actually discuss the peaks and valleys, and you can always get another wave of infection after a few months where it peaked and then descended. Say, for example, Italy or France or Germany can actually have another wave 3 or 4 months down the road. Nobody can predict unless they are very clear about the preventive steps and put in all of their resources to prevent that from happening. So that's all I can say. I don't know whether I answered all the questions. Maybe you had a third question. Can you repeat that for me?
Doctor, that was about the public sector
okay.
companies that are developed.
Yeah, I think there is some sort of public sector participation. I don't know if any specific government as such is taking the initiative. So, for example, in the US, for the Moderna vaccine, they have allocated about $500 million. So this is in collaboration. So they are doing it in collaboration with the National Institute of Health, or one faction of the Institute of Health, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. So NIAID has allocated $500 million to Moderna. So basically, it is the US government money going into that. I think they have also they call it like investment and so on. So it's slightly different from being initiated by the government as such.
Okay. So we have,
I'm not familiar with the situation in other countries. Actually, in India also, I think 1 or 2 candidate vaccines are there in the pre-clinical stage. So that's all I know. I don't know about the exact role of the government of India in the vaccine venture.
Now I request Mr. Karthi to turn on the mic and the video and put his question. Mr. Karthi.
Yeah, thanks to the organizers. I think the speaker would not have read the specific chat message. I just read it for the common interest. We have been hearing for long that India has not been sensible in antibiotics usage. Now, going by the timelines, the professor mentioned how far it is practicable that I am just quoting a news feed. ICMR has written to 12 institutes selected to run the clinical trials to fast track all approvals, but warned against lapses in protocols and guidelines. The political statement was that it was being fast forwarded to get it by the Independence Day, though it's a far-fetched idea. So now my question was that would a half-cooked vaccine be more dangerous in hampering the immunity of the Indian population? Incidentally, there are many doctors in this audience, and Dr. Abdul Hamid had covered a portion of my type portion. And during the reply, Dr. Subramanian had explained the answer to another part of the question, the second one. So I would just like to supplement my question. Do Indians, by virtue of the surroundings that we live in, though bad, do we have an inbuilt immunity resulting in a lesser than normal fatalities when compared to other countries? Over.
The mortality rate actually is I mean, one could say perplexing or confusing. The reason being there is uncertainty. So the only thing reasonably certain is the number of deaths. Again, it is not totally clear because sometimes I read reports that the mortality is not being reported fairly by some countries and so on. Even in the US, I know that there have been doctors who have come and reported that not all deaths are being reported properly. And I'm sure that in every country this is happening. And how much error factor in is one element of uncertainty. But still, whatever is being reported, so if we take that as the numerator, uncertainty there. But in the denominator, there is a lot of uncertainty. So we don't know the number of positive cases clearly. So the mortality rate to compare between countries is very difficult. So for example, Italy, France, and some other European countries had much higher mortality rate compared to US. And some other countries, including India, have a much lower mortality rate. Russia seems to have a very low mortality rate. So all this is really perplexing. So it is not clear. But I think what we should focus on is the number of cases and maybe the test positivity rate. So if the test positivity rate is high, we are not actually doing enough testing, and we are not capturing the mortality also, because we haven't tested a lot of people who are dying otherwise might be positive, and we don't know because we haven't tested them. So that's all I can infer from the data. And to your other question, whether a half-baked vaccine will cause, I think as long as the vaccine is safe, if it is not generating enough immunity, that is still okay. I think some immunity is better than no immunity. So I would be happy. So personally, I would be happy to take a vaccine which confers less than 50%, and a lot of the influenza vaccines, and I've been taking that regularly. I think every other year I get flu, maybe the severity. So if I get SARS-CoV-2 infection and it is less severe because I had a vaccine which was not very effective, I'm fine with that. But if the vaccine causes serious adverse effects, then I'm not fine with that. And I think that is a reasonable approach to have.
Now I request Dr. Venkatesh from Chennai to take up questions from YouTube channel, because there's a whole lot of viewers online in YouTube. Dr. Venkatesh.
Thank you, Dr. Srikumar. And there are quite a few questions the viewers have asked. The first question, which three people have asked, Dr. Amarpal Singh and Mrs. Jisha and Abhi Sebastian, is that whether this COVID will reinfect and can we expect a second wave?
So actually, I would like to split that question into two. The second wave, typically, as we understand, is not like the influenza cases. So the influenza vaccine only provides us immunity to some specific strain. So that is why we need to get vaccinated every year and some even every few months, because these newer strains come. We don't know much about the SARS-CoV-2 virus now, but from what information is available, it hasn't mutated enormously, giving rise to totally different strains. And there is no clear evidence that people have been reinfected by SARS-CoV-2. There have been some reports, and the most rational explanation is that is because the PCR test is very sensitive and it is actually picking up some reservoirs of dead virus or viral segments it is picking up. That is why. So you could say in that sense, I mean, it's real false positivity, but it is not reinfection. Now, the second wave can occur not because of reinfection. So think about it. The percentage of people who are becoming positive. So US has a population of 330 million, and currently less than 3 million are infected in the US. Let's assume that maybe 10 times more are actually infected. We have only found the tip of the iceberg. So let's say that 30 million actually became infected, but they were not symptomatic or they were not tested. So even that leaves out 90% of the population as susceptible to infection. So the second wave will actually come and pick out from this 90%. It will spare, assuming that they carry the immunity. So whoever was infected in the first round will be spared in the second round, but whoever was spared, and that is 90% actually, even with this statistics which I presented. So that is how the second wave can occur. Whether the people who were infected in 2020, whether they will be reinfected again in 2021, January through December, we don't know yet. It doesn't seem to be very likely, but cannot rule it out. But it will definitely, it can come, and it is likely that a newer wave will come in a few months in the countries which were ravaged by the virus, unless they are very, very careful. I think that is fair to say.
Okay. Sir, there is one more question I will place, although there are many. Two people have asked a similar question. One is Chitra Devi and another is Unnikrishnan about mRNA. Whether that mRNA vaccine can cause any discomfort in human body in future. That is one. And the similar related question is whether this mRNA of Moderna vaccine packaged, which is from the company Moderna, in what envelope they have packaged it, and how does that get into the human cells? So this is two questions related to the same mRNA. The first is how it will create discomfort in future in our human body.
Yeah, I think this is a new method actually. So the mRNA method, so Moderna and now Pfizer has also come up with this in collaboration with BioNTech. But I'm not familiar with a lot of literature on this method. And all I know is that there have not been any successful vaccines which has been brought into the market by Moderna, and I don't know whether anybody else, any other company has done using this method. So it is a newer method. So, but the principle is that it will be translated into, in this case, spike protein, and they have done some studies, of course, mostly preclinical, but some at least phase 1 studies, and they haven't seen serious adverse effects, but they have not been followed up for a long time. So this needs to be looked into. I don't know whether there is a lot of published literature on mRNA, because there have not been many studies actually. So that's all I can answer. I'll have to look into it in greater detail once studies become available. Can also look into if already there are some steps I am not aware of in terms of the safety of the mRNA methodology. But it seems like a reasonable approach to me based on the science which they are presenting.
Please let me take over, Dr. Venkatesh. Dr. Abdul is having a question. Can you please turn on your video and unmute your microphone, please, with your question. Dr. Abdul. Ms. Parimal Misra, I think you can go for that question.
Good morning, Dr. Subramani. It's an excellent talk. I have two quick questions. As the SARS-CoV-1 or MERS-CoV-1 vaccine is not come, how do you think CoV-2 vaccine duration will protection? What I'm talking about, L versus B cell type of vaccine difference. Will it be 1.5 year protection, or how long it will do the duration to protect it, even you give the booster dose?
So the what happened with MERS and SARS-CoV-1 was for SARS-CoV-1, there was some interest initially, and quickly the pandemic disappeared. And so as you can understand, this is all done with profit in mind. Otherwise, the pharmaceutical companies lose interest, the funding agencies lose interest. So funds dried up, and that put a break. For MERS also, it affected mostly in the Middle East. It was I think mainly confined to Saudi Arabia and some other countries, if I remember right. And then people lost interest. But the work that went into the development of vaccines actually helped in the early stages, at least the preclinical part. It is too early to say that only one dose will be enough. So there might be a booster requirement. And again, since our experience with the virus is only for 6 months or so, we also don't know if newer strains will come. So newer strains, how much immune response we can generate in terms of the adaptive immunity, the immunogenic titer. So all this will determine this. So it is too early. So these are all supposed to be delineated in phase 2 and particularly phase 3 studies.
Yeah, thank you,
we
Doctor.
We can't answer those questions unless we have additional data.
Yeah, can I ask another question? Yeah, as this is a coronavirus, and you know it has a proofreading activity. So much of mutation will not happen like other RNA virus, which size is more than 30 kb. And so you think different strain will be evolved quickly, or if you have a vaccine that will be very stable? Like flu vaccine, you don't have to change the vaccine every year, the construct to make it new thing. What's your take in it?
Again, as I was saying, I'm not a virologist, so whatever published evidence I could gather from that, it seems that even though there were some stray reports that there is a more lethal vaccine, more lethal virus, and so some of the vaccines which we might develop may not be effective for that. It is not clear that there are multiple strains at this stage. There have only been some reports, and most scientists have not accepted those reports. So as it appears, so as I was discussing in the talk, the spike protein and the AU inhibitor, so that's the mechanism it is using to enter the cells. So if we can actually develop antibodies to the spike protein, that will be a good method to tackle this virus. So unless the virus evolves in a way and finds another way to enter, so if you have antibodies looking for spike proteins to block, then it will not work. So we have no evidence that this is evolving at the pace of, say, for example, HIV or HCV, where there are strains which are very diverse and so on. So far, we only have experience with this virus for a little more than 6 months. So it is too early to write the final story on this virus. So we have to wait and see how it evolves and how the vaccine science related to the SARS-CoV-2 also develops and evolves.
Okay, Dr. Subramani, if you allow me, I will ask 2 more questions.
Okay.
I want Mr. Shivam to turn on the video and on the microphone to put his question. Mr. Shivam. And Mr. Alok, you can be ready for the next.
I think Shubham is just late, I think. So maybe go for the next question.
I see one person with Moto 5 Plus. I don't know what his name is. Can you put on your question, please? Turn on your microphone and your video. Please introduce yourself. Moto 5 Plus.
Dr.
Okay, now we will
Srikumar,
go to,
otherwise you can read out the question also.
Okay, now we have one Anna Jin. Can you please turn on your microphone and your video? Please put your questions. Anna Jin.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Proceed.
I am a student studying in 12th. I have a question.
Yes, go
That
ahead.
can you explain more about cancer vaccines? Most of the cancer is due to genetic disorder. So, is there any chance to produce vaccine against genetic disorder?
So for example, there are some viruses which cause cancers. So one is the human papilloma virus. So that causes cancer, for example, cervical cancer. Then there are also what are called oncogenes and so on. So there is a vaccine for HPV or the human papilloma virus. Now, what the therapeutic vaccine, so that is the HPV vaccine is for prevention actually, so it's not for treatment. The therapeutic vaccines, so basically what vaccines do, so traditionally we are developing vaccines to trigger the immune response so that when they see the virus antigen, they will be ready to fight. Now, in terms of therapy, so we are just making the immune response work as treatment or as a drug. So for that, what needs to be done is we have to see the tumors as foreign elements. So the tumors actually cause mutations and so on. So they develop specific antigens which are not present in the normal cells. So you have to use those and then develop antibodies to that and then inject those antibodies. So it is a very resource intensive method, and this has excited a lot of researchers and people think that immunotherapy holds a lot of promise in cancer. Again, I'm not a cancer researcher, but I have talked to other oncologists and cancer researchers, and they seem very, very excited. But it is very expensive, it is resource intensive, and it is very laborious. So it is still not mainstream. So chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation are the mainstream methods, but immunotherapy is slowly catching on. That's all I can say at this time.
Yes, Dr. Chikmaran.
Yes, sir. And I think we are coming to the end. I thank Dr. Subramani for his wonderful talk during this COVID issue which we are facing all over the world. I thank the organizers, Dr. Manabendranath Bera, and the organizers of Breakthrough Science Society for have conducted this webinar on COVID-19. I request the participants to visit the website of Breakthrough Science Society and subscribe. There is also a YouTube link also where you can subscribe so that you will get notifications to your address. So please subscribe it. Breakthrough Science Society is all over in India, working to improve the mental capacity or to develop scientific temper among general public. So with that mission, this Breakthrough Science Society is working all over India. I thank once again all the participants of YouTube as well as Zoom for have taken part in the webinar. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this concludes the session.